All it takes is one look at Todd Grimshaw's fear for Gary Windass to realize that something deeply wrong is happening behind closed doors in Coronation Street. And if Theo Silverton has pushed things too far, he may have just made an enemy far more dangerous than he realizes. Gary was recently told by Sarah Platt that Theo could be abusing Todd, and that information clearly hit him hard. The biggest shock for Gary is not just what Todd may be going through, but the fact that Theo is someone he has actually considered a mate. That creates a very uncomfortable truth for him, because it means he may have been standing close to a man capable of awful behavior without noticing it. Rather than rely on rumors, Gary chose to see things for himself and invited himself over to Theo and Todd's flat. That decision matters, because Gary is not someone who reacts mildly when he believes a vulnerable person is being threatened. He has a long history of crossing dangerous lines. This is a man whose past is filled with darkness, guilt, and violence. He was responsible for the factory roof collapse that killed Rana Habib, and then manipulated events to push suspicion onto Carla Connor. Later, he killed Rick Nealon in self-defense. But even that spiraled into something uglier when he stepped into Rick's criminal world and became increasingly ruthless himself. Gary may now live a quieter family life with Maria, but that side of him has never felt fully gone. It has always seemed buried rather than healed. That is why this situation feels so explosive. Theo is not simply a difficult partner or an unpleasant man. For months, Todd has allegedly been trapped in a pattern of abuse that has included emotional manipulation, financial control, and frightening violence. The knife incident showed just how dark things had become. Todd being so broken that he dared Theo to end his misery says everything about how destroyed he had become emotionally. And the moment Todd stopped showing fear, Theo ended the relationship, not out of mercy, but because losing control wounded his ego. What makes Theo especially disturbing is the way he keeps pulling Todd back in whenever he senses that control slipping. When Todd began moving on with another man, Theo secretly spiked his drink so he could step in as the rescuer and drag Todd back into the toxic bond again. Then came the marriage, which should have been a happy turning point, but instead felt like another trap. Theo pushed Todd into the registry office and created a situation where Todd felt he had no real freedom to say no. That says far more than any romantic gesture ever could. It was not about love. It was about possession. George Shuttleworth's suspicions growing stronger also adds weight to everything. The sudden wedding already alarmed him, but hearing Theo hurling vile abuse in the flat the very next day pushed those fears much closer to certainty. Once George shared his belief that Todd was being abused, the people around Todd were forced to start seeing the relationship through a very different lens. Gary then walked straight into that atmosphere and watched carefully. What stood out most was Todd's body language. His nerves around Theo were obvious, and even his shaking hands while making tea spoke volumes. Fear like that is often far more revealing than words, especially when someone has been conditioned to hide what they are going through. Gary saw enough to know that Sarah's warning was not empty gossip. When Todd left the room, Gary confronted Theo directly and told him that he knew what sort of man he really was. Theo's denial was predictable, because men like him rarely admit the truth when they are still convinced they can keep controlling the narrative. But the important part is that Gary has now seen the dynamic with his own eyes. He is no longer on the outside guessing. That is where this story becomes especially dangerous. Gary has never been the sort of person to sit back calmly when he believes someone is being hurt. If he truly accepts that Todd is living in fear, then Theo may have triggered exactly the kind of protector instinct that can turn Gary reckless. Gary tends to justify extreme action when he feels someone nasty needs stopping, and that old violent streak still seems close enough to the surface to resurface under pressure. With James Cartwright's exit already confirmed, it is becoming harder to ignore where this may be heading. A whodunnit brewing on the Cobbles makes Theo's future look even shakier, and Gary immediately feels like one of the most volatile pieces on the board. The thought of him taking matters into his own hands does not feel far-fetched at all. If Theo keeps pushing, the danger may no longer be only for Todd. it may be Theo who ends up facing the full consequences of everything he has done. And if this storyline is building towards something deadly, Gary looks like the kind of man who could once again find himself dragged back into the darkest version of who he used to be. If you want more Coronation Street breakdowns, character analysis, and the latest twists from the Cobbles, subscribe and stay with the channel.